If I said that every MMORPG needs some form of a role system to immerse players into the world, I don't think there will be many of you who would disagree. Being able to specialize in doing something specific creates this sort of feeling that's actually quite hard to put into words. I'm sure some of you can attest to the fact that being recognized as the group's frontline warrior, for example, is just really rewarding, if I can call it that. On the other hand, there are players who pride themselves on being versatile. If their group needs a healer, they'll pick up a staff and make sure you stay alive. In both examples, the role system is the gameplay element that makes these possible. Since we don't yet have any concrete information on any mechanics Riot would like to implement in their MMO, I wanted to go over what in my opinion would make a good choice for a role or class system. But saying that, I think there's a very important thing we need to talk about first. The player's role is usually a direct result of them picking their class. But what exactly is a class though? It might seem obvious, but I think this question is a bit tricky to answer, purely because there is no established universal rule to what it means. A lot of classic games like WoW or EverQuest follow the classic RPG system of having classes that represent what your character does in the world and picking them during character creation. If you pick a ranger, you can safely expect him to be somewhat sneaky, and creating a mage will make you cast shiny fireballs. This was the convention ever since the early beginnings of D&D, on which a lot of these early MMORPGs were based. With time though, this way of doing things slowly started evolving into different forms. Players wanted more freedom in how they can build their character, so many new entries into the genre implemented new ways of doing so. Albion Online is a fantastic example of this. Instead of picking a class during character creation, your items determine what you do. At first glance, it might seem like the game completely ditched the class system, but that's not exactly true. Even though the class you play isn't explicit, it's still there, just expressed through items. A character using an ice staff and wearing robes becomes an ice mage. A player equipping a bow and leather armor is undeniably a hunter or a ranger. So as you can see, the idea of a class becomes slightly more modeled with time. It might not be an option you pick at the start of your journey, but something you slowly shape through playtime and specialize in over time. That's why I like to set up some ground rules when it comes to naming things. When I say class, I specifically mean a specialization a player chooses either explicitly, like in the case of WoW, or implicitly through other mechanics, like Albion's items. Now that that's established, let's see which class systems could fit Riot's MMO the best. Even though these two systems I just mentioned are still the most popular, there's one more that I think is worth mentioning, and that's the freeform skill point system. Even though it's less common, it does have its advantages over the implicit and explicit class systems. The main ones being freedom and the number of available choices. With it, you have a ton of individual skills that you can upgrade that benefit a very specific aspect of your gameplay. For example, a one-handed skill that only affects your one-handed damage, or a destruction damage skill that only affects your destruction spell's damage, and nothing else. This level of granularity means you can make any combination you can possibly imagine, because there's nothing restricting you apart from something like a level cap. With potentially up to 100 different things you can put skill points into, there's bound to be something for everyone. This does come with a very important trade-off though, and I'll be talking about it even more later, but this level of freedom inevitably takes away from the class identity. Since the players can put their skills into whichever aspects they want, the metaphorical borders and corners get blurred and shaved off. I am not saying they stop existing, because a meta will always form to group different player builds together, but it's definitely less distinct to something we'd see in a game like WoW, where players often identify with being a specific class, and go to great lengths to convey that. It also isn't very appealing to casual players. This number of choices might be fantastic to someone willing to invest time in learning about all of them, but casual players would probably just like to be able to pick a class that looks cool and just jump into the game. That's also why I don't think it would be a good fit for Riot's MMO. Why? Well, if you've been following Riot's games for some time, you might have noticed that one of the main goals in their design philosophy is to keep thematic distinction to the maximum and the skill floor to a minimum. And as previously stated, the freeform skill system, even though good in its own right, probably wouldn't work great with this. But what about the other two? Let's start with the less obvious one, the implicit class system. I chose it because a lot of modern MMOs adopt this system as one of their selling points, the omission of a traditional class system. So why exactly is it so attractive to so many players? To answer that, let's take a look at it and how it would fit in the world of Runeterra. The common factor between all of the games using an implicit class system is that they focus on immersion and are in general pretty grounded. Games like Albion Online and New World pride themselves in creating an ecosystem where players naturally and organically shape the in-game world. As you can probably figure out, it's not a coincidence. The big pro of this approach is that it just makes sense. Why shouldn't you be able to pick up a one-handed sword and just start swinging it? By the experience of using a piece of equipment, it's more immersive to allow players to grab a weapon and just use it immediately. Maybe not as well as someone who's been training with it, but still there won't be a prompt saying, "This is a warrior item, you can't use it." The big caveat of it is unfortunately the very idea of tying what your character can do to a piece of physical equipment, for example. This makes it impossible for a character's skills to come from perhaps their background, origin, their training, or anything else. It also heavily blurs player identity. In many cases, becoming a completely different character is just a case of swapping a piece of equipment, and suddenly you're no longer a frontline tank and you just became a backline damage machine. If we compare that to the world of Runeterra, so many characters are defined by their culture, rather than by what they wield into battle. Take a look at characters like Ashe, Yasuo, or Akshan. They do have legendary pieces of equipment, but they aren't what makes them unique. It's where they come from, their relations to other characters, their training, and many other factors. That's why I ultimately think the implicit class system also wouldn't be right for Riot's MMO. Does that leave us with one option then? Not exactly. Even though the idea of picking a class at character creation is very, very simple and quite old, it can differ in a variety of ways. The main one that splits it into two different versions is its interaction with factions and races available for the player to choose. The classic way of doing things is you pick a faction you want to play, then you pick your race, and then your class. Job done. There may be some combinations that are restricted, but in general the process looks vaguely the same no matter which way you go. Even though this process is quite simple and not very exciting, that's usually great. We don't want to be locking out certain combinations of choices because it may lead to a big imbalance in one of the factions. I think one of the most well-known examples of this is in early days of WoW before the Burning Crusade, where Paladins were exclusive to Alliance and Shamans to the Horde. This was promptly changed in the next expansion. To examine if it would fit, let's try and map this system to the two Runeterran factions and see if they click. I've chosen Demacia and Noxus as my examples, just because they're quite vanilla and very recognizable to most people. I think a good place to start would be a standard warrior/tank melee class. For both sides, the picks seem obvious. Demacia would have the Dauntless Vanguard, and Noxus would have a member of the Legion. Right? Kind of. As you can probably tell, their theme varies greatly. The Vanguard is all about being few in numbers, but being incredibly well disciplined. Almost like a literal wall for the enemy forces to clash into and break upon. On the other hand, the Legion is composed from the most capable and fierce warriors Noxus has to offer. Their focused brute strength and ferocity being able to snap armies in half. So as you can see, they're not direct replacements, but definitely similar in their purpose. Let's move on and see what else can we compare. If we move on to the range class, I think we can safely put Demacia and Rangers on one side. Even though we don't actually see much of ranged weaponry, we know Quinn uses a hand crossbow, so I think we can probably assume the other Demacian scouts do too to some extent. When it comes to Noxus, it's a bit trickier. We know they heavily use gunpowder during Conquest, so I think it wouldn't be a stretch to put some form of a gunslinger here. Especially with the fact that we know characters like Samira and Captain Indari use guns quite heavily. But again, these aren't an exact match. Especially if we take a look at the last class, the equivalent of a mage. Demacia has a complicated relationship with magic users, so I'd be shocked if it had a playable magic user. And if we look to the other side, then Noxus loves its magic users. From the Great Legion all the way up to the Ravenbloom Conservatory, Noxus is steeped in magic. So what's going on? Surely there's no way we could have mirroring classes for both of these factions. That brings us to my personal choice for what system they could use for Riot MMO, and that's the asymmetrical class system. Its premise is very simple. Each faction has its own set of classes that fill a similar purpose but aren't identical. Sometimes they even have specialty classes that work very differently. This would allow every single faction to fulfill its fantasy to its fullest without being pulled down by the others. This also fills the purpose of thematic distinction. Each region would be naturally different, making the in-game world more varied and distinct, as opposed to homogeneous. I think that would fit extremely well with the variety of places and characters Runeterra has to offer. There wouldn't be an issue where introducing a very specific and unique playstyle to a faction wouldn't be possible just because it wouldn't fit into a general class structure. And just imagine the possibilities with characters like Freljordian shamans, Ionian battle musicians, or even Shuriman temple scavengers. I'm sure a lot of exciting possibilities await us in the future. But that's just my take. What would you like to personally see in the game from a character creation aspect? It's quite a complicated topic, and my knowledge doesn't exactly stretch as far as to include a big amount of other MMOs. So maybe you have a different idea of how it could look like. If you do, leave it in the comments below. It was actually very fun to try and come up with the possible classes that the game might include. So I'm thinking about doing a few full-length videos covering each region and what they might include in a bit more detail. But for now, that's all for today. I wanted to thank you for sticking through it with me. I'm trying to make each of these videos better and better, and I hope to see you next week for more. But for now, I'll see you all in the field.